Hello, Internet! Welcome to episode 193 of the Assorted Calibers podcast, the Second Amendment podcast that is a little bit for everyone. I'm Weer'd, and with me, as always, is my lovely hostess, the most accommodating, Aaron Paulette. How are you doing, Aaron?
I don't know why I find that funny about me being accommodating, but okay, it's probably because right before we get started, you're like, nope, hang on a minute, I gotta go poop.
I mean, it is an endless list. It is we are doing this a day later because my daughter she's still sick, but she's feeling a little bit better. I can talk about that in a second. But and so last night I was just like, you know what, Aaron, I think I'd just rather not do the show because I've just been super busy all day. And I said, can we do it tomorrow? She's like, absolutely. Thank you so much. And then also you were saying she was feeling a little crappier just this afternoon. And you're like, if you want to not do the show, well, that's cool. I said, well, we'll see what happens. But again, very accommodating. And then, yes, just before the show, I had to make a bathroom break of the number 2 variety. And Aaron's like, just go do it. So, in case anyone didn't realize how awesome Aaron Paulette is, there are some fine examples.
He had ghost peppers with his dinner.
No, with just my lunch and my breakfast. The
Breakfast makes it worse.
The dinner was chicken soup for the poor ill child.
Oh, it just amazes me the things people will eat that cause them pain, and yet they keep eating. Meanwhile, and this is something that makes one of my friends just, laugh himself silly every time he thinks about it. The first time I took Adrian to a Thai restaurant because he'd never had it before, and I wanted to introduce him to the deliciousness that is pad Thai. The waitress asked me how much spice I wanted, and I've had this conversation before. And when I say mild, what I define as mild and what they define as mild is not the same thing a lot of times. And so I looked her straight in the eye and I said, I want it white girl mild. She understood what I meant, and it came back perfectly seasoned for my taste. And now Adrian, every time he thinks about it, he just practically pees himself laughing. It's like, white girl mild. It's so funny.
I mean, that is a key thing, because yes, the definition of like I've had to adjust my cooking because my wife and daughter will be like, this is altogether too spicy, and I'm like, it's not even barely spicy. I'm throwing more hot pepper on top of mine because it's just not even close. And but like, no, my mouth is on fire. Oh, okay. So I make the joke of all right, I'm making another batch of weak sauce chili because I now make my chili white girl mild. And it's not even white girl mild because the white girls still go, it's spicy, but it's good. But at the same time, also, I would walk into an Indian restaurant or a Thai restaurant as a Caucasian male with blonde hair and go, I would like it very hot, please. And they would go, the boy doesn't mean it. And I remember there was one time, my wife and I were just dating, and we went to an Indian restaurant, and we had been to one Indian restaurant that was around the corner from that one, and their food was, no matter how hot I ordered it, it was mild in my opinion. And we decided to try a different place, and I was not into any of this mild crap. And so they looked at me and said, how hot would you like it? And I said, hurt me. And the waiter went, excuse me, sir? And I said, hurt me. It was very similar to the scene when Edward Norton and Brad Pitt are outside the bar after 3 pitches of beer, and Brad Pitt turns and says, "I would like you to hit me as hard as you can."
You hit me in the ear.
And they hit me in the ear. It was delightful. But the next day was not as delightful. That was I was still living with my parents at the time, and I was stepping out of the bathroom and toweling my hair off, and my mom's like, "Did you take a shower?" And I said, "Yeah." "Didn't you take a shower last night before you went to bed?" Which is my custom. I am of the variety of I like to go to bed clean.
Me too.
And yeah, I don't get the people that, and I actually generally don't like the feeling of like stepping outside after being freshly showered. I feel like my skin feels really dry and prickly when I do that, but that's just me. But she's like, "Did you just take a shower?" And I said, "Yes." She said, "But didn't you take a shower last night?" I said, "I did." And she kind of gave me, because I said, "The Indian food was exceptionally hot. And I didn't want to burn a hole in something." I needed to extinguish the flames with a lot of water.
Okay, that's actually not where I thought you were going. I thought you were going to say that the backsplash was so prominent that it was like, no, toilet paper is not going to handle this. I need running water.
It was just I've finished cleaning myself up. It's nothing but clean paper, but it still burns. It's soap and water. And the soap and water works. By the way, I don't know if you've ever encountered this, but and I've not done this firsthand, but it is my understanding that Johnson's baby shampoo is the prime relief factor for people who have done pepper spray training.
I don't know anything about that,
because it's designed that you can get it right in your eyes, and it won't sting your eyes like shampoo will, but it is a detergent, so it can cut through the capsaicin oils and allow it to be rinsed away. So there.
The more you know.
Something to put in your kit bag. But I just alluded to it. My daughter was sick yesterday. She was throwing up like all day, didn't eat anything all day, and was not consuming much water. And then today got up, was a little bit better, but still a little under the weather. I'm like, "You had a rough day. You can stay home again from school." And seemed like she was perking up, but she really wasn't eating much and all of that. And then come like about 3 or 4, she really started taking a turn, and she started developing a fever, and I was getting kind of concerned. But the good news is that finally I said, just lay on the couch and watch TV. That's fine. And then finally it was like, I was doing the dishes, and I'm like, "How much longer is left on your show?" "I've got 10 minutes on this one." "Okay, when that one's done, let's go upstairs and get ready for bed." And she got upstairs, and then she looked at me and said, "What'd you make for dinner again?" I said, "I made chicken soup." "Is there any of that left?" I said, "Absolutely. Would you like some?" "Yes." So came downstairs and warmed up. And honestly, I pulled it out of the refrigerator. It was still mostly warm. I just gave it like a minute in the microwave. And she had herself a bowl of chicken soup with some saltines and was talking my ear off for the first time in 48 hours. And I'm like, "You're feeling better." So hopefully this is a good sign.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, she's your kid, so anytime she's talking, that must mean she's feeling better. Yes, and she definitely takes after me in the talking department, not my lovely wife. Oh, so how are you doing, Aaron? I was actually glad for the venue change as well, because my day wasn't as bad as yours, but I just woke up. I was a complete C-word for most of the morning and a good chunk of the afternoon, and I only started feeling better at about 3, 4 o'clock. And so, hey, you're not feeling really into it? You know what? I could stand to take a day off, too. Unlike some days when I have very good reasons for it, I had no idea why. I just got up on the wrong side of bed, and just every little thing was just making it worse. But I'm feeling much better now, and one of the reasons that I'm feeling much better is that yesterday when we didn't record. That would be Monday the 21st. Indiana signed constitutional carry into effect. And, we had just talked about it last week, and now here we are. We're at number 24. We are so close, and we're still in the top of the year. Oh my gosh, we are definitely going to hit 25 by the end of the year, if not more. And that's just fantastic.
Well, the big one is, and I just Googled, it was a couple hours ago, actually, didn't get a chance to just before we started recording, but Georgia still has not signed it in. It has passed the Senate. It was introduced in the Senate. It has passed the House. So it is now on the governor's desk, but he has not yet signed it, even though he has been very, very vocal about supporting constitutional carry and about wanting to sign this law. And so I believe it was Stephen Gutowski. It was either Stephen Gutowski or Cam Edwards, one of the two sober, wonderful news-related Second Amendment podcasts that I listen to, speculated that since he has not signed it just immediately, he may be planning a political venue maybe a little bit closer to November, just to make a big burst into the scenes with some pro Second Amendment stuff. Because I looked it up, and in Georgia, there is actually Remington is actually relocated there. I don't know if that would be necessarily the venue that I would choose, but Georgia's also home to Heckler and Koch, and obviously Glock is in Smyrna, Georgia. I think everyone knows that. And then also Daniel Defense. So it could be at any one of those company headquarters might be a great place for the governor to set up a signing. I could see that as being politically useful, though I also, it's in the show notes, I looked up the text of the bill and got a little grumpy because the law specifically states upon the signature or passage of the law, it goes into effect. So it goes into effect immediately. So the moment the governor signs it, Georgia will then have constitutional carry. And so, come on, it would be fine if it would be like starts on the first of the year, the beginning of the next session. So he has, 3 or 4 months to play with where it doesn't make a lick of difference, but that's not the case. So, oh, well, I would be shocked if it does not get signed into the law. And I don't think anyone in Vegas would cover my bet.
Do you know if he's up for re-election this year?
I believe he is.
It seems to me, considering all the statements he's made about how if it comes across his desk, he will sign it, that if he doesn't sign it in this election year, I'm not going to say it'll torpedo his chances, but it'll really hurt him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, actually, I'll throw it in the show notes. But Stephen Gutowski of the Reload actually sat down with the governor, and it was part of the Reload podcast, and he's also got some video of it as well. And he has openly said, like, yeah, if constitutional carry comes on my desk, I'm going to sign it. So it is really a done deal. It's just a question of, I think he's planning on taking full political advantage of this.
Probably. But that does beg the question, okay, when's he going to do it? I really feel like if he's waiting to make a splash in the fall, I think that's waiting too long. And I think that might backfire. I honestly feel like the longest he can wait would be the summer. And I can see a point of 4th of July for signing it.
That actually, when you were speculating the exact date, that was the date that immediately popped into my mind as well.
I mean, it's far enough away to be annoying, but it's close enough that it's not like, oh my God, it'll never get here. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I hope he doesn't push it any later than that.
Or it could just be simply the for the sake of lining up the venue and just set up the logistics and the security and all of that. Who knows? Mm-hmm. Also, it's one of those, if he's planning on doing to Remington, because Remington, I believe, is the newest large manufacturer to arrive in Georgia. It could be that they're just not ready for prime time just yet, because I mean they literally just moved to Georgia. So we shall see. Time shall tell. But either way, it's certainly looking like there might be some other states still in the wings, but it's looking like Georgia will be the 25th.
Mm-hmm.
We're certainly 2023 is not going to happen in a nation that is not at least 50% constitutional carry, which is really amazing. Since when I started doing this game, it was still you couldn't carry in Minnesota and was it Minnesota or Wisconsin now? Shoot, it was Wisconsin, right? Was Wisconsin the one that
I don't remember.
It's been so long that now I don't even remember which one was the Midwestern state that didn't allow concealed carry. But yeah, it's been so long, and maybe someday Florida will get constitutional carry.
It'll be a while.
Yeah.
I mean, I have said for a long time that Florida will be the last southern state, but John Richardson of No Lawyers, Only Guns and Money has speculated that I don't remember if he's North or South Carolina, but whichever of the Carolinas he's in,
he's North.
He says no, they're dragging their feet too. So who knows? Mm-hmm. But like I've said before, and I'll keep saying it, nothing succeeds like success, and so the more states that pass constitutional carry, the more likely it is for other states to join the bandwagon. It's like, hey, this is happening, this is popular, these states aren't developing into open warfare and bloodshed, we should probably do this. So even though Florida, I'm not even counting on it happening, but just the more states that get it, the more likely that it'll be our turn. So I applaud every other state that goes either constitutional carry or permitless carry.
Yeah, and borders also have a lot of meetings, so Georgia going should actually have a major factor, because New Hampshire for the longest time was just New Hampshire, why aren't you jumping in this? Because literally it's $10 for a handwritten card that doesn't even have your picture on it. It is literally, why bother permit? It's just the permit doesn't even give you peace of mind. It's just a formality. And meanwhile, the New Hampshire was just never passing constitutional carry. It's like, what are you doing? And then suddenly Maine got constitutional carry. And so then it meant that every state that was bordering New Hampshire either had constitutional carry or was Massachusetts or Quebec. And, well, that was convincing. Actually, I don't even think New Hampshire borders Quebec, now that I'm thinking about it. I'd have to look at the very, very northern border of New Hampshire.
But yeah, borders absolutely matter, because once Georgia passes that, then all of the states bordering Florida, well, there's only two of them. It's Georgia and Alabama. But those two are constitutional carry. And honestly, the state capital being where it is, very far north, up in the Panhandle, it's less North Florida and more southern Georgia, to be perfectly honest, which is another reason why I really feel that Georgia needed to pass it first. And so the legislators here in Florida will hopefully look at Georgia and see that it's not degenerating into open warfare, and maybe we'll have a chance of passing.
And just as a few, I did look it up, and there is a border crossing in northern New Hampshire. I just wasn't sure, because that little section of New Hampshire and Maine I don't ever go to, because paddle faster, I can hear banjos.
Well, thank you for that tidbit, Weer'd. We can all sleep easier knowing that information.
Well, so shall we get on to the next segment, Aaron?
Oh, sure.
Or the first segment?
Recently, there was a shooting match for 3D printed guns that had some requirements that left people scratching their heads or leaving the match. Oddball is here to give us more information on what happened.
Welcome to Oddball's Corner Pocket. In the past year or so, I've gotten into 3D printing. In fact, I just bought the parts to build another one. Of course, this being a Second Amendment podcast, I'll answer the inevitable question. No, I haven't printed a gun. Yet. That's not to say that people haven't been doing so. It's actually been almost 10 years that Defense Distributed introduced the world to the almost entirely printed Liberator. and folks have been off to the races since then. Fast forward to today, and you can find examples of just about anything. It didn't take too long for someone to come out with a single-shot .357 Magnum. There's a wide assortment of revolvers, semi-auto pistols, and even at least one .308 and a .45-70 rifle floating around. Most designs will still use off-the-shelf parts and have you print the receiver and grips and maybe some other parts, but there are others that have just about the entire thing printed, up to and including the magazine. It's become popular enough that there's even now an annual shooting event for these makers. Recently, the second annual National Gun Makers Match was held in St. Augustine, Florida. By all reports, most folks had a lot of fun, and there were some great designs shown off. Unfortunately, as with a lot of things, there was also a good bit of drama. Of course, I have to say that I wasn't there, I wasn't involved, and I'm just reporting what I've seen posted on the internet. As we all know, everything that is posted on the internet is 100% true, has no spin, and is completely reliable. Okay, now that that's out of the way. The National Gun Makers Match is ran by Guns for Everyone National, an organization that describes itself as, quote, a national nonprofit organization that certifies firearms instructors, operates national and local firearms competitions, and provides training, including courses in personal protection, in small arms safety, use, and marksmanship. Besides that, I could find precious little about the org. The Makers Match is the only competition that they list, and all of the training class links go to Intuitive Defensive Shooting's website. Oh, and if Rob Pincus isn't the man in charge, he's definitely in charge of their social media. Having an organization that pretty much only exists to run a single event is not unusual, nor particularly shady. I've been a member of a few such orgs that exist solely to run conventions, etc. It's the proper way to do things. 1, to deal with the event's money and property, and 2, to protect the folks that are running the event from liability. Heck, I'm pretty sure that a lot of insurance companies won't even deal with you unless you've already set one up. The sending you over to IDS's website, that troubles me a bit more. If it was simply, hey, we think these folks are cool and you should check them out if you're looking for training, I'd be cool with it. The fact that Pincus's org suggests Pincus's training company wouldn't have me batting an eyelash. The issue I have is that the Guns for Everyone Nationals site makes it look like you're selecting one of their classes and then sends you to the IDS classes page. If you're not paying attention and see that the page has the IDS logo on it and IDS web address, then it would be pretty easy to think that you were still on the Guns for Everyone Nationals page. That rubs me the wrong way. So, beyond that, what were people having issues with the match itself? Well, for starters, some folks took issue with some of the information they asked for up front. I can verify that they were asking for legal names and very possibly social security numbers, which they apparently kept recorded in a Google spreadsheet. The name thing I understand, but it is going to be a controversial subject with the types that are in the 3D printed guns crowd. More on that in just a bit. As for the social security numbers, what? Why? And they stored that info in a Google document. No, just no. Why would you do that?
Flat, dirty, Turkish, horseback, flat, Morton, Philip, Bunker, Martin, Perkaluma, Burton, Durton, Bush, Martin.
Google Docs is cool and nifty and all, but secure it f***ing ain't. Oh, the reason for the social security numbers is that they were doing background checks. That's not a normal thing as far as I'm aware. Then there's the issue with the venue. Apparently, they had a last-minute issue with the original range and had to move to a different venue. I have not seen the reason for the change in venue, but stuff happens, and I'm glad they were able to pull off finding a new venue in time. The new venue apparently required what has been described by a few folks as a, quote, pseudo 4473, and a copy of your driver's license. I've also seen at least one person declare the new location to be a, quote, cop range. I have not been able to verify that, though. There were also people upset that media was running around with cameras. This is one of those things that I've told people in the past. Hey, if you don't want to risk your picture getting taken at the event, don't go. So, about that legal name thing. This isn't the first time that issues with legal names and Pincus have shown up. Not terribly long ago, Pincus got into a Twitter argument with a few folks, including our lovely co-host Aaron Paulette. One of the things that he did in that argument was attack folks that, quote, hide behind pseudonyms. The problem here is that he's decided that he wants to be a big man in a community that has its roots in a world where it's pretty much assumed that you're not going by your legal name. Sure, there are folks that go by pseudonyms because they're doing illegal stuff and are trying to hide their identities. But there's a good number of folks that do it for other reasons. Weer'd, for instance, goes by something other than what's on his driver's license, because while he walks the straight and narrow, he lives in a state that's not exactly gun-friendly. It's a very real possibility that a gun owner up where he lives will lose their job or even have Child Protective Services called on him if the wrong person finds out that he's a firearms owner. We also have Erin as another example. As a trans person, the name on her driver's license is very much not what she uses online or at public events, etc. Other folks use handles simply as a way to represent their personality, or use something a bit more unique than, say, John Smith. As for me, a bit of the personality thing, and that I've been around long enough that a lot of systems couldn't accommodate the length of my name. Oh, and the general rule at the time was that it was frowned upon to use your legal name. How things have changed. And the 3D printed gun folks, they have a very real concern that while what they're doing is legal now, the government may come after them anyways, or it may simply change its mind over what's legal and what's not. So, there you go. I hope you found this entertaining and possibly even learned something. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions for future segments, I can be reached either on the ACP Facebook group or at Oddball at gunscarstech.com. Yes, Weer'd, I will be getting some more segments thrown together for you. Oh, speaking of which, I'll also see if I can get some more of my thoughts beat into submission and posted at gunscarstech.com. Until next time, have a good one, and don't store sensitive data in Google Docs.
I gotta say, Aaron, with the bit about the Social Security number, like, I don't even put my Social Security number on my 4473. I really despise when anybody other than a government agency asks for your Social Security number.
You can get away with that? I thought that was required.
Nope. If you look at the form, it is optional. I have never put it on a single one. Now, some people, if you have a similar name to somebody else, then you very well may benefit you. You may get a delay otherwise, and a lot of people, when they get a delay, might fill out the form again with their Social Security number. I don't know the exact detail, but some people have gone through and put their Social Security number on as a way to see if they can get past the delay. Yeah, it is not required on your 4473. But so many people use it. For the longest time, Massachusetts driver's licenses, your license number was your Social Security number. Isn't that a great idea?
Well, I mean, back in the 70s and 80s, it wasn't a problem, really. Mm-hmm. I mean, identity theft really only blossomed in the computerized 90s.
Yeah, that is true. Yeah, when you didn't have to be in person to do all this stuff, and that seems to be doing really, really well, especially if you're also doing it from a country that doesn't have extradition to the United States.
I mean, like way back in the early aughts, before I knew better, I had a thought, well, how about if we just make our Social Security numbers our cell phone numbers? And let you know how long ago this was. This was when you moved, you had to change your cell phone number because of your provider, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And I just thought, well, hey, if you did that, then, you know, the number wouldn't have to change and people wouldn't have to keep memorizing new numbers. This was also way before smartphones.
Yep.
And so, yeah, that was back when I was young and naive.
Mm-hmm. Also, the bit on on the quote unquote cop range, I have to wonder about that. That, I mean, could be apocryphal, but also there's a ton of like gun clubs that I know that also happen to be the qualifier range for the local police, just because not every police force can build their own gun range, and not every, you know, county or state will build a gun range just for the police. So it could very well be that the local rod and gun club is also where the cops show up to run their qualifiers.
Yeah, I'm not really bothered by going to cop places, but given the 3D printed community, and especially given the way law enforcement organizations as a whole, as opposed to the individual members, but you know, when Sheriff's Association and of course the ATF are making all these noises about how 3D printed guns are ghost guns and illegal and we've got to crack down, I can definitely understand why people in this community are going, I don't know if I want to be here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there's just so much, like, just weird. I mean, you can hear Oddball's frustration in the segment. Yeah, and I will add that, again, I am not making any direct accusations, but I will add that there has been some discussion that Rob Pincus may be working either with anti-gun groups or the federal agents as a way to entrap people who might be 3D printing things that aren't exactly legal. And I am not saying that is or is not happening, but I will say, whether Rob Pincus means it or not, he has become a tool for the anti-gun groups. Because when this story, I first heard about this story through back channels and on Twitter and things like that, where it was not something that I would in good conscience be able to report on in this show. But yeah, so I was hearing about all that. So I was just Googling, you know, Rob Pincus to see if somebody from the 2A community had picked up on this story. And all I found was just article after article after article of various sources that were not friendly to the Second Amendment, quoting Rob Pincus, mostly him speaking out against the NRA, which I don't disagree with most of what he's said about the NRA and the problems it has gone through. But yeah, he is one of those guys that has the credentials of being a gun owner and a firearms instructor and all that, and also someone who's been willing to speak kind words for gun control and speak out against gun groups and the Second Amendment community as a whole. So use caution moving forward.
And I have been very quiet about this whole thing because people who know me know my opinion, and I didn't want to introduce any sort of bias on this segment.
Mm-hmm. Part of prepping is having skills to go with the gear. Xander brings us his independent thoughts on this very subject.
Welcome to Independent Thoughts with yours truly, Xander Opal. This one is a mix of prepperish thoughts and so-called rights group commentary. A person needs to be able to set down a task or job, to be prepared to do so, no less. On the prepper side of things, you never know when something higher priority might pull you away, requiring someone else to finish what you started. It can be as simple as calling someone to turn off the oven at a certain time because you had to rush a pet to the vet, or as complicated as putting back together something you took apart to fix. Sharing knowledge of how to do things is the core of Aaron's blue-collar prepping site. By and large, people knowing more, and the why of the knowing, is a good thing. I once ran into a bit in a novel where one character ripped into an organization because a different character had attempted to make himself indispensable and unfireable. To paraphrase, if a person cannot be fired because of their knowledge of a system, two people are at fault. That person and that person's boss for not documenting and training for future replacement. There's always the no fault of anyone hit by a bus making a person unavailable as well. I found that it takes a lot of effort to put one's ego away on this out of fear of being replaced. I try to instead cultivate an attitude and approach that shows high reliability and value as a helpful resource. It has also helped me move on from being replaced in a very professional way. There's also a different level and direction of having to be able to set down a task, and that is when civil rights are being restored. I am focusing, of course, on the right to keep and bear arms for the defense of self, family, community, and nation. The NRA and smaller groups, such as one in Tennessee, have rightfully earned a bad reputation for not finishing the task of rebuilding recognition of rights. The gravy train of donations in the face of anti-gunners tastes mighty good. If good legislation were actually pushed through, the 900-pound gorilla might have to go on a diet and return to the roots of being a national organization for marksmanship. It is human nature to not want to have to give up a comfortable, familiar position. Job searches suck, yet it needn't be so in the wake of great success. I mean, how can you top helped restore and sustain civil liberties on your resume, combined with bringing people together from all walks of life? Have fun, be safe. I hope I gave you something to think about.
You know what? This segment really reminded me of a conversation my wife and I were having, and that is that the culture at large, all caps, of the United States is really started to become very much urban. And I would even go as far as to say that the culture of the United States kind of rests in New York City and Los Angeles, you know, both with Hollywood and all the news agencies, and a lot of the television shows all taking place at either one coast or another. And I kind of feel like that's kind of driving some of the issues that Sandra's bringing up on, is that urban dwellers, especially people that are in like the mega cities, you can't really, you can be specialized and you really do need to depend on others for your daily needs, just because cities are such logistical nightmares. And gone is the idea of the, hey, let me just learn how to fix my car, or I will grow my own food, or I will even cook my own food, has kind of gone by the wayside. And I hope we're at some point, especially with all the unrest and COVID. Actually, my wife was pointing out that COVID really did start swinging the pendulum, where you got all the people learning to bake bread and learning to cook at home and all that, now that they were stuck at home for 2 years. So I don't know. I would hope that there will be more people that will start getting the jack of all trades aspect to their lives, as opposed to being specialized like insects.
Yeah, the one thing that really stuck out in this segment is when Xander mentioned that maybe the reason certain rights organizations aren't concentrating so much on rights anymore is because when that happens, they lose that sweet, sweet supply of money. Mm-hmm. And it's very easy for me to say this because Pink Pistols and Operation Blazing Sword is a charity. I don't even get paid. That's how little we make. But it does give me the ability to say that I am actively working towards the dissolution of our organization. Mm-hmm. The day when we no longer need a group for teaching queer people that it's okay to own guns, because everyone already knows that. Mm-hmm. So, okay, it's probably a humble brag, and I don't like doing that. The point that I'm making is, yeah, once you start getting paid for something, it gets really, really difficult to turn that tap off, even if doing so would further the goals of your organization.
Oh, I mean, I lived that. I was a federal fisheries observer. I worked for the federal government in, as we would say, to protect the environment and protect the fish from from overfishing and damage to the environment due to the fishing fleet. And I rapidly started seeing reports showing up that, you can't get yellowtail flounder on George's Bank. And I'm like, I was just out on George's Bank, and that was all we could catch. There were so many of them, and they're selling at 25 cents a pound because they're insanely common. What's going on here? And I realized that, if they said, you know what, the regulations are working and we're not overfishing and the stocks are recovering and things are looking really, really good, the first thing the government would do is, cool, we'll slash your budget, we'll keep a skeleton crew, and you know what, those of you left over, you let us know if there's a problem and we'll give you some more money then. Just keep the problem going. It was very, very strange when I left that job and then went over to a pharmaceutical company where I was working on animal testing of pharmaceutical drugs, and I realized, wow, I felt really icky in that last job, and then now I feel really, really good about what I'm doing because, needless to say, the primary goal of my job was making sure that all those animals were as happy and healthy and comfortable as they could be. And
before you killed them and dissected them.
Yes. I mean, we had literally said it was literally or harvest their organs was the actual industry term we used. But yes, but it was we killed them painlessly.
Up until the time you killed them, they had great lives.
I mean, there would be. I'm not going to lie. There would be some discomfort to the animals. I mean, we were doing stuff like giving them cancer and things like that. So, that's not great. But at the same time, you try to keep them as comfortable as they can be.
I think it's darkly funny that the job in which you gave animals cancer was more fulfilling and felt more honest than being a fish cop.
I remember one time I was sitting up in the wheelhouse of a fishing boat where the captain that I had shipped out with several times, and actually his brother was very well known in the community as well. So I knew his whole family, and all very, very nice guys. And he looked at me, he said, "You know what, Weer'd? I like having you on board the boat. You're a really great guy. But there's nothing in that notebook of yours that you're working on right now that's going to help me." And he was totally right. He was totally right. All we were doing was one more restriction. Very similar to, here in Massachusetts or New York or Chicago or all that. They pass their gun control laws to lower crime. Crime goes up. Well, shoot, we must pass more gun control laws so we can lower crime. Okay.
So it's kind of funny you have talking about crime here. If you were in Florida in 2014, you probably heard of the so-called popcorn shooter. I was here and I remember a big media to-do about it. But did you know that the trial for the shooting only just now finished 8 years later? Attorney Benjamin Blatt watched the trial and gives us his thoughts.
I am very pleased to welcome to the Assorted Calibers podcast, Benjamin Blatt. Benjamin, you're a firearms lawyer, and we wanted to discuss the case of Curtis Reeves.
Thank you. Well, first of all, let me preface this by saying I'm licensed in Indiana and Michigan, and the Curtis Reeves case was in Florida, so nothing I'm discussing is legal advice. I'm just going to be discussing generalities of the trial itself and the case itself.
Isn't that just like a lawyer?
Well, I would like to keep my law license. So, Curtis Reeves, the case is very interesting because it was about 8 years from the incident, which I believe was January of 2014, to trial, which was just completed last week. And in that 8 years, I got the impression that the defense team and maybe the prosecution team was kind of hoping Mr. Reeves would just die, because he was 71 at the time of the shooting. He was 79 at the time of trial. and he has been in bad health since before the time of the shooting. But, time runs out. You have to take things to trial eventually. What makes this case especially interesting is that back in, I believe it was 2017 or thereabouts, there was a stand your ground self-defense hearing where the defense attempted to get the charges dismissed on the grounds of self-defense, in accordance with the way Florida law works on that. And essentially, that was an entire mini trial. The actual hearing took about 2 weeks, had most of the same witnesses, most of the same testimony. So going into this trial, there should have been no surprises for either side, because everything had been laid out and tested before, and they had a total of 8 years to prepare. And yet this trial was absolute horrible lawyering from both the prosecution and the defense. From the start of their opening arguments to the end of their closing arguments. And it's my opinion that the prosecution failed to put on a case sufficient to convict Mr. Reeves, but that the defense almost lost the case in their closing argument.
So before we get too far into it, can you give just a brief recap of the case, certainly how it was presented as evidence?
Sure. So the initial presentation, and I'll actually start with the media narrative because I went and found a 2014 article, I think from ABC News, like from the day of the shooting or the day after the shooting, describing it. The initial case was presented as man shoots another man in a movie theater over throwing popcorn. And the actual media coverage from back then talked about a sheriff's department statement in which the sheriff said that the shooter tried to shoot again, but his gun jammed, and that he shot the man over an argument that started with the man texting his 3-year-old's babysitter and wound up with popcorn being thrown. Now, the way the article read, it implied that the deceased threw his own popcorn at Mr. Reeves, and Mr. Reeves shot him. What we found at trial, and what is basically the undisputed narrative in many senses, is that, first of all, the daughter in question, I believe, was not even 2 years old, and that she had been left with the company that Mr. Olson, the deceased wife, worked for, that she was at the company daycare at the time they were in the movie theater. So he wasn't texting any babysitter, and she wasn't 3 years old. So all those details right there were completely incorrect. Additionally, one of the undisputed things that was clearly shown on the videotape presented by both sides from the security camera footage was that the popcorn thrown was Reeves' own popcorn. The deceased took it from his hands and threw it back in his face. So that detail was wrong. Then we have the sheriff's statement that the gun jammed. Otherwise, Reeves would have continued shooting. No testimony was offered by the prosecution. No evidence was offered by the prosecution. No testimony or evidence was offered by the defense that indicated anything other than Reeves fired one shot and then placed the gun in his lap because as a former police officer, he wanted to appear, and he knew to appear, non-threatening so that no one would shoot him as an active shooter. There was no aggression involving a jammed gun. Otherwise, he would have kept shooting. None of that. But that detail was never really corrected. So the media narrative for 8 years leading to the trial was man shoots another man over throwing popcorn, and boy, he was really aggressive at the time. So then we get to the actual trial. And first of all, we have both sides immediately say, okay, well, here's videotape, which shows that the popcorn was Mr. Reeves' own, snatched from his hands and thrown in his face. Then we have testimony from the widow of the deceased that, well, her daughter was at the daycare for the people she worked for. She didn't say that her husband wasn't texting them, but the implication is that he wasn't. And just to note, there's a lot of statements and stuff that weren't admissible in this criminal trial that if the civil case against Reeves goes forward, might come out. And I don't know how much of that detail you're interested in. But one of the more interesting components of that is that the widow gave an interview with the media 2 years after the shooting, in which one of the things she said was she intended to sue the theater in part because they served alcohol but did not monitor the patrons. And the implication there is that, oh, Reeves must have been drinking. Well, that wasn't even a little bit true. No testimony was given to that effect. There was no evidence whatsoever that he ever purchased alcohol. And the section of the theater where you would drink alcohol if you purchased it was the section behind where this all happened, which was closed to patrons that day. But that was part of the media narrative for 8 years leading up to this was not only did he do this aggressively, but he might have been drunk. So when you have that happen, and just to give a little background on criminal cases and the way they work, you're not supposed to convict someone unless you find them guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. And the best way to describe that in my mind is to say to someone, that is the doubt which, if 20 years down the line, you're thinking back on your time as a juror, if you stop and think, wow, maybe he was innocent after all, I feel really bad about convicting him. You had reasonable doubt. If you feel good about your decision 20 years on, if you're still firm that he was guilty, that generally is beyond a reasonable doubt in terms of how a juror thinks. The problem with that is that most jurors not only don't understand reasonable doubt, but don't care. They look for more likely than not. So you've got to convince a jury, if you're the defense attorney, that it is more likely than not that your client didn't do something. And the prosecution is usually aiming to prove more likely than not to a jury anyway. To a judge, they definitely have to use the heightened standard, but they can usually get away with a lot more with juries. So that's how juries go into this. And despite the jury questionnaire phase where you ask a juror, do you have bias? Have you heard about this case? Unfortunately, jurors still tend to lie. And there's a couple of prominent cases that are in the media now in which people are arguing for fresh juries because a juror came forward afterwards and indicated or admitted they lied on a questionnaire. But when you're going into a case that has 8 years of media buildup, you have to expect that media bias has seeped into everybody's minds. That jury is coming in poisoned, and there's no good way to avoid it. So when you're the defense team, you should assume that you have an uphill battle because that jury is fighting you from the get-go. So that's how this case opened, basically, with the prosecution having home field advantage, having the advantage with the jury's mindset. Then things went downhill for the prosecution. The prosecution had 8 years to prepare this case. They had basically a practice run with full dress and everything. They had all their witnesses in a row. They should have been ready to go to prove this case. But the defense had 8 years of deposing over 100 people or about 100 people, and they had their own practice run, and they had lots and lots and lots of statements under oath by everyone who might testify in this case. And the prosecution put on their witnesses, and almost every single prosecution witness was then impeached by prior inconsistent statements under oath. That was the one thing the defense really excelled at in this trial, was impeaching witnesses.
So, are we at the verdict in your opinion of this?
Well, yeah, sort of. So basically what affected the verdict in my mind is this. The prosecution case was based on, here's our police investigation, here are our witnesses. Every witness they put on, or almost every witness, was impeached with prior inconsistent statements, which made them seem like they might be not entirely truthful or not really remembering accurately. So then the defense puts on their case, and their big thing, which I think was a bit of a misfocus, they spent almost all their time on this when it really should have been maybe a day's worth. The police investigation in this case was absolute junk. Now, the state knew about this for 8 years and should have taken steps to mitigate the effect, but for some reason they did not. As it turns out, at every step in the initial investigation, the police investigating failed to follow procedure or only incompletely did what they were supposed to do. They didn't process the scene correctly. They let the footage, the security footage of the incident, they let the 15 hard drives be taken by the theater chain to a different state and then assumed that it was being returned without alteration when they picked it up at an attorney's office almost a week later. And when they did so, it turns out they only got 10 of the 15 drives back. The 5 drives that would have recorded any edits to the footage were not present. The theater then went in and ripped out the security camera setup completely. So why that matters is that the cameras were supposedly motion activated. So you only see bits and pieces of everything involved and long, long spaces of essentially dead air. But there is no way to know for sure that that dead air wasn't edited by the theater for liability reasons. So the state knew this for 8 years. The defense knew this for 8 years. State impeached a lot of witnesses. Then they put on their case. They kind of misfocused it, but they focused on the investigation was junk. Then they focused on Mr. Reeves was in poor health. He knew that he was at special risk because of his poor health. His special police training made him know use of force issues and knew when to mitigate and how to avoid. And in this case, he couldn't. He fired one shot to defend himself. But the key thing that came out in the defense footage, they're a slowed down expert. And if you get a chance to watch that, find a clip of their video expert. He's boring. He takes almost a day and a half all by himself. but he puts on a masterclass on how video can be edited correctly forensically and how it can be zoomed and enhanced, and why in most trials that's not done properly. And in his zoomed in enhanced forensically correct video, you can actually see that about 8 seconds before the popcorn grab and throw and shot, the deceased takes a swing or throws an object at Reeves, starting this ball rolling. And Reeves had said, oh, he hit me with something in the head. And there was enough defense evidence to indicate that, yeah, maybe he got struck by something in the head, followed by the defense expert on use of force, who said, well, you know, the timing for all of this is such that you can't possibly draw a gun from pocket carry and get off a shot in under a couple of seconds. And the timed separation between when the popcorn is thrown back at Reeves and the shot is under 1 second. Reeves already had that gun in his hand because he was apparently drawing it after the first strike 8 seconds previous. So that's how defense put on their case. Now, prosecution attempted to impeach all of those defense witnesses the same way defense had, but their preparations were complete, just unprofessional junk, basically reduced to shouting at the witnesses and using what's called prior incomplete statements. Basically, that means like when you're trying to impeach someone, say, didn't you say under oath previously this, this, and this? They pick and choose which words they're repeating to the witness, or saying just this fragment of a sentence, which is incorrect. And when the defense calls them on that, they have to read the entire statement. And in every single one of those circumstances, it turned out that that witness had been telling the truth and their statement had not changed. It had just been taken out of context. So prosecution consistently throughout the case looked incompetent. Defense they did cross excellently. They did their directs okay. They tended to ask a lot of leading questions, which is improper. But this judge, and I'm going to be blunt because I'm not in Florida, I don't care. This judge is absolutely horrible and should not be on the bench. She should turn in her robe. She doesn't know how to rule on objections. She doesn't know how to rule from a matter of law on a number of things. But the defense figured out the phrase to be able to ask a leading question without the judge saying, no, you can't do this, which is to start every question with agree or disagree. Now, for you or me, that's the same thing as yes or no. And a yes or no question is considered a leading question, which you're not allowed to ask on a direct examination. But because they didn't say yes or no, they said agree or disagree. This judge, who again shouldn't be on the bench, apparently didn't understand that that means yes or no and let it go. So defense did okay there. And basically, they were able to show that prosecution may have proven or may have presented evidence that Reeves acted inconsistent with self-defense, because the question of whether or not he shot the guy is, that's a given in a self-defense case. So the question is, was he reasonable? And that goes to the 5 elements of self-defense, which in general are a question of, are you innocent in this? Was this reasonable? Was the use of force proportionate? Did you have an opportunity to retreat? And basically those sorts of elements. And it all came down to the question of whether or not Reeves acted reasonably and proportionally with the use of force. Now, the prosecution case was no, it was throwing popcorn. Shooting a man over that is not reasonable and it's not proportionate force. But defense basically put on enough evidence to say we can't know because the police investigation was horrible. There's too much stuff that we will never know because the police failed to investigate it properly, even though in Florida, when you allege self-defense, they're supposed to investigate from that angle. And ultimately, they put on enough evidence that from a legal standpoint, from a question of did the prosecution prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt, my thought on that when they closed their case was no, of course they didn't. It should be a not guilty verdict. But, and the big but here is, did the defense overcome the bias in the jury? And I went into the closing arguments and after the closing arguments thinking to myself, no, that it was going to be a guilty verdict because defense had not overcome that bias. And it was not helped by the closings in which defense, despite having 8 years to prepare a wonderful defense closing argument, rambled on like, what was his name? Matthew McConaughey, trying to give some philosophical point. They failed to really focus on anything. And in my opinion, it would have been a guilty verdict from that point, except for one mistake the prosecutor made in their closing argument when they read the statute to the jury. Both sides do that in closing arguments in criminal cases. That's standard. But when the prosecution read the statute, they emphasized that if someone is over the age of 65 in Florida and you batter them, it goes from a misdemeanor to a felony automatically. And they emphasized that to the jury. Now, the problem with that is that when you actually read that statute, and I'm not a Florida attorney, so this is just my read of law in general, that is a charging modification. And what that means is that a battery is a battery. If you don't cause serious injury, it's a misdemeanor act. But when you go to court, if it turns out the person you battered was over the age of 65, you will still be charged as though it were a felony. But it's not in and of itself a felony at the time it happens. The problem is that the way the prosecution read that to the jury, they basically said, when he did this, because Mr. Reeves was over 65, it was a felony if he hit him at all, whether or not there was serious injury. If he hit him with a pop bottle, if he hit him with, say, popcorn, which gave the jury room to say, even if that first event 8 seconds before was, not entirely nailed down, did something actually hit Mr. Reeves? Did something miss him? Was it a swing? Was it a thrown object? They could definitely say he was hit by some popcorn, because everyone agreed to that. Reeves was hit with popcorn, even though Reeves testified he didn't know what it was at the time because it happened so fast and he was reacting to the prior battery. But the jury went into that deliberation knowing that the prosecution had told them that being struck with anything, regardless of the injury level, was a felony. And in a self-defense case, in a use of force case, if you are stopping a forcible felony against yourself, you are assumed to be reasonable with the use of lethal force. So the big elements in the use of force and in self-defense for Mr. Reeves, the big question in my mind as to whether or not he even acted reasonably or proportionally, the big question the jury might have is taken off the table. Because they went into that deliberation not having to worry about was it really reasonable, was the force proportionate, because the prosecution told them that it was a felony act, even though technically it really wasn't. So they came back in about 3 hours with a not guilty verdict. And the second charge involved shooting the widow because she was hit by stippling and slightly by the bullet as it hit her hand passing through the deceased's chest. And that was, of course, not guilty as well, because if you're not guilty for use of force in the death, you are not guilty for the lesser charges either. So, like I said, I went into this thinking he was going to be found guilty based on the media narrative. Based on the prosecution having 8 years, I assumed that they wouldn't take this case to trial unless they actually had a case that could prove a trial. And they were horrible because they didn't spend their 8 years preparing. And the defense was horrible because they didn't spend their 8 years preparing closing or opening arguments well. They did well on preparing their prior statements to impeach witnesses, but that's about the only thing they did really well. Now, they did get an acquittal, but I think they got an acquittal despite themselves.
Well, that is certainly an interesting case. I certainly know that when I heard about it first, I'm like, oh, this is a dirty shoot. And now to hear it's an acquittal is a surprise, but unfortunately not a blindside surprise given how court cases have been going recently.
Sure, and even as far as the acquittal goes, it's a surprise, but I think there's still reason to believe it might have been a dirty shoot. Mm-hmm. And that boils down to a couple things. One is that ultimately Reeves could never say what exactly he was struck with. And he knew at the time he was struck that it wasn't such a serious injury. I mean, he claims he'd been struck in the head, which from his experience as an officer, he said he knew could be serious. But he knew the actual effect wasn't serious on him at the time. So that raises the question of whether or not shooting someone is proportional. Now, he did testify that the deceased was coming over his seat and was about to leap on him, which factors in towards maybe it was reasonable. But the big thing that makes me question that statement is the video, which shows the actual shot. In that video, he is leaning forward, pointing the gun forward. Now, if you're a trained officer, which he was, he had almost 3 decades of experience, including founding the SWAT team in Tampa, basically picking up all sorts of training classes. Then he did 10 years as head of security for Bush Entertainment, that Busch Gardens and all that stuff. Lots of experience, lots of training on his part. There's no way at some point in all those decades he didn't learn about shooting from retention, which is what you would do if you're worried that someone is so close and such an aggressive physical actor that they might be able to take your firearm. But he did not shoot from retention. He defaulted to the training of shooting as though he were offensively moving forward. And that, in my mind, at least argues that maybe he didn't actually feel a threat to his life. Because if he really felt threatened that the deceased Mr. Olson was coming over that seat and about to jump him, he should have fired with it a lot closer to his body, retaining that weapon against being grabbed. Mm-hmm. Especially since the popcorn had literally just been grabbed out of his hands. So I wonder, it's not definitive, and that I think still leaves enough ground for reasonable doubt that you would still correctly be acquitted. But I wonder. So yeah, he got acquitted. I think the jury found the correct verdict in this case because the prosecution simply did not put on a good case. They had 8 years to prepare, and they just did a poor job at it. Defense, despite failing in their opening and closing arguments, despite failing in witness examination in a lot of ways, did more than enough to show that there was reasonable doubt here. And it has an interesting effect, because if he'd been found guilty, the civil case against him would have been a slam dunk. He would have unquestionably been found liable, and they would have gone after him for whatever money he has left. Because I say left, his defense probably cost well over $1 million. And the way I factor that is that he had 4 attorneys present each day of the trial, and that was 2 partners and 2 associates. You got to figure that was about $1,500 in legal fees every hour, just on the attorneys, for every day of the trial. For about, call it 8 hours a day for 10 days, plus the jury selection. Plus, they did that whole thing 5 years previous at the use of force self-defense hearing. That doesn't include the experts. That doesn't include about 100 depositions, each of which probably cost about $4 to $5 grand each. There's no way that defense didn't run him 7 figures. So whatever he had left, the lawsuit's coming after. But I think the lawsuit's in serious trouble because he was found acquitted, which the lawsuit can't really use against him in terms of, oh, he was guilty, he definitely did this. And the reason that's important is because in a civil lawsuit, it always raises the question, regardless of the jurisdiction, there's always some level of contributory negligence. Now, in some jurisdictions, any level of contributory negligence kills a case. In other jurisdictions, the court factors in how much contributory negligence there was. And in this case, the criminal evidence, which can be used in the civil trial, shows that apparently the deceased maybe didn't start the argument, but certainly escalated it to its physical form. And that's a lot of contributory negligence for dying. On top of that, there's the statements that weren't admissible in the criminal case. And then there's the outside stuff that will probably be harmful to the plaintiff, such as the deceased's alleged possible criminal record. I've never really looked into that deeply, but there were statements made by the widow that indicated this wasn't the first time he got into a fight over something minor. And that character can be used against him in a civil case to an extent. The flip side of that is that there were apparently witnesses that the prosecution could not call who had offered to testify about Mr. Reeves' prior behavior at other screenings at that same movie theater. That he was not a stranger to causing conflicts in the theater because he was a grumpy old man. And that might be a factor, too, in a civil case. Because even if the plaintiff is somewhat contributory negligent in terms of the negligence factor, then you have the defendant who apparently liked to start arguments in movie theaters, even knowing that that behavior could be reckless. So the civil case might be interesting. It might get dismissed. It might go forward. That's going to be up to the Florida courts. But the outcome is mostly interesting because this was a use of force case where the media narrative for 8 years utterly failed to match what was testified to in court. And none of us would have known it if he'd taken a plea deal or died. You know, there were times I thought he was going to die during the trial. There were times I thought I was going to die by the time that trial was over because it was so slow. But, it's interesting for that alone. Otherwise, it's not a particularly interesting case. Kind of like the Rittenhouse case.
Mm-hmm.
What made the Rittenhouse case interesting was it was the single most recorded act of self-defense that ever has gone to trial. It might not be the single most recorded act of self-defense ever, but it's certainly the single most to ever go to trial, despite all the evidence of what actually happened. Mm. And that's kind of what I look for. That's why I was commenting on. That's why I was reviewing a Florida case, was that with all this wonderful coup stuff, it's hard to trial watch in the local courts without being annoyed. But thanks to all the streaming efforts, I can go online. I can watch a Florida case that involves use of force, which is pretty universal. There are differences between the states in the details with the general stuff, whether or not you go into that use of force incident being innocent of starting it, basically, with reasonable intent, with reasonable use of force, whether or not you took efforts to mitigate this, whether or not you tried to retreat. Andrew Branca has the AOJ triad, which is whether or not the aggressor had the ability, the opportunity, and was actually putting you in jeopardy. All of those factors are pretty universal for all the states. And they matter because, they teach you how to approach what happens in your own state, even if the courts are different and even if the particular rulings are different, just in general. And they also have a tendency, now that everything's being streamed, to show just how bad prosecutors are. And not all prosecutors are awful, but it's worth noting that these prosecutors in these prominent cases act this way and skirt the rules and ignore the rules, knowing that what they're doing is on camera, being broadcast to the world. This is how they act when they're on camera. And as has been pointed out by other luminaries, but which I will repeat, prosecutors generally act this way because they practice law on easy. As a defense, as a litigation attorney, there are consequences to my acts. I can be held liable for stuff I do wrong. I have to watch what I do and stay in the bounds of the rules. Prosecutors generally enjoy statutory immunity from liability in civil cases, and there's very little oversight for ethics violations. There was a Florida public defender who was also commenting on this case, who writes law journal entries, articles for law journals. And one of the things he noted is he'd done a law journal on, in Florida, discipline of prosecutors who have ethics violations in their closing argument, which is generally, a prosecutor who starts testifying, which is frequent, or who brings up testimony not in evidence, or who makes statements that are inadmissible, all sorts of different ways you can be violating ethics when you're doing closing arguments in a criminal case. So he did a law journal that reviewed 30 decades, or not 30 decades, 30 years, 3 decades, my apologies, that reviewed 3 decades of disciplinary complaints and resolutions in the Florida courts and by the Florida ruling body. I don't know if it's their Supreme Court in Florida or if it's a separate ethics board, but the group that oversees attorney ethics. Over 30 years, precisely 3 prosecutors suffered any consequences. Not just severe consequences, any consequences for ethics violations in their closing arguments, which it has been shown doesn't have the most impact in criminal cases, because unfortunately most jurors make up their minds early on in criminal cases, but still has an impact. And they do this because they literally know that there's no consequences for them. And that's a problem, But it's worth watching these trials if you get the chance, if your audience gets the chance, because most people think they're never going to have to worry about a criminal trial. But the reality is that choice, even if you're not a criminal, if you're a law-abiding citizen, the choice about whether or not you're going to have to worry about the criminal system might be out of your hands and might be made in a split second when you least expect it. So it's good to know what you're getting into.
Well, thank you so much for your insight on this. This was a very interesting trial, and certainly one that had a lot of misinformation, and I'm glad we could combat a lot of that. So thank you for coming on.
I apologize for going way over your time budget on that. I just know it's the time.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you so much for coming on the show, Benjamin Blatt.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So, Weer'd, what this reminds me of is another self-defense shooting that we talked about either in late November or early, maybe even mid-December of last year, and that was Kyle Carruth killing Chad Reed in Lubbock, Texas. Mm-hmm. And we analyzed that to heck and back, and I haven't heard more about it, but I believe we came to the conclusion of that may have been legally defensible, but morally that was shady as hell.
Oh, yeah.
And that's the same feeling I get from this. Just by the letter of the law, everything this guy did was legal. But morally, ethically, I mean, if he felt threatened, he could have left. He could have changed seats. He could have done other things. And I looked at some of that footage, and he actually left the seat to complain and then came back. And so between that and the other things that Mr. Blatt says, it does seem kind of shady. But at the same time, I really can't disagree with the legal decision, and that bothers me.
Yeah, there's one of those instances where, just because it's legal for you to do something doesn't make it a great idea. And I think Mr. Reeves has demonstrated why it's just better to just avoid conflict whenever possible, just because in the event that you end up shooting somebody, it comes to blows. It's never going to be easy. You might luck out and get one of the cops that's like all right, we reviewed the footage and you know what? Good grouping. But especially in this day and age, it's really getting up there with people like, Kyle Rittenhouse was just the most well-documented shooting. They had multiple angles on all of these people, the people that he shot, and multiple instances where there were direct assaults just before, not even the subjective nature of it, and yet still he was dragged, and there are still people who call him a murderer. And I also talked about in the case of Mark and Patricia McCloskey that according to the letter of the law, and I'm not a lawyer, but I believe that Mark McCloskey would have been perfectly justified at shouldering that AR and just start blasting away at those protesters until they started retreating, because they broke into a private road. And so therefore they were breaking and entering, and therefore the castle doctrine kicked in. I think everyone is glad that he did not do that, because that would have been a very, very ugly trial. A tough case to morally justify. So yeah, if you're out in the lobby complaining and the movie's going on, or I think it was even I think the movie hadn't even started yet, because I think it was the previews.
Mm-hmm. That's my understanding.
First up, it's the previews. Who cares?
Purists.
Yeah, I guess so. I actually, when I went with a group of friends, I made it a point to boo at the crappy looking trailers. And overall, I found that I did not get any. I looked around and read the room to see if anyone was super annoyed by my boisterous behavior, and nobody was really bothered, especially since I did shut up when the movie started. Though if you want to hear what my natural state of movies, you could download an ACP film track, because I like to talk during a movie. I got stuff to say.
You could have ended that earlier. I like to talk.
I do. That's why I do a podcast. Oh, but yeah, if you're out complaining, like I've had a movie where it wasn't a great movie, and I'm like, you know what? I'm not that interested in seeing this movie, and the camera operator is having some trouble, and the sound is gone, or the movie went off the track, and I've just said, you know what? Walked up to the manager. Is there any chance I could get my money back and I can just go home? And they're like, yep, there you are. Here's your money. And I went home. And so, yeah, it's one of those, there's a dude on his cell phone and he's being loud and he's causing problems. And I asked him nicely to stop, and he told me to go pound sand. Is there any way I can get my money back and either go home or go to the next showing or go to a different screen? Just or pick a different seat, sit a little further back. I certainly think that Curtis Reeves probably wishes that he either went home or sat a little further back. It sucks that you might have to do that. It sucks that you might have to do something to accommodate someone who's being an asshole. But you know what? Better to accommodate an asshole than have to put an asshole in the ground.
You've perfectly summarized my relationship with you. Oh, people, I'm only mean to him because he likes it.
You can hear me laughing. I like my Aaron spicy like I like my pizza. Oh. And you know what else I like, Aaron?
Our patrons.
Our patrons and our listeners. Let's... Okay, Daddy does play favorites. I do love the patrons a little bit more than the regular listeners, but if you can hear the sound of my voice, I do love you too. Just not quite as much as our patrons. And so if you would like to feel that love, go to patreon.com/Assorted Calibers podcast to sign up. You'll get an early release of the podcast, plus you can get bonus content like the ACP film tracks, where you can hear Weer'd and Company talking about various facts and trivia and admiration of a vast number of films. We're over 120 now, so there's a huge catalog for you to choose from. We've got movies that you have, our hilarious blooper reels, and for the very best of the patrons, they get the bonus show every month, the ACP Mag Dump.
You've heard it once, you've heard it several times, I'm going to say it again. Please remember to rate us on Apple Podcasts, subscribe to us on the platform of your choice, and share the show with your friends, both online and off.
I get a blog. It's called Weer'd.com, and I'm also on this show called Handgun Radio. It's in the Firearms Radio Network. You probably haven't heard of it.
You can find me in all the usual places, and I posted on my blog last week how I was a guest on a podcast called Liberty Blues. And honestly, if you're one of my listeners, there's nothing new. It's the questions I've answered dozens of times. But if you are just an absolute Aaron Paulette fan, go and you can listen to my segment, and I'm just hanging out and talking about gun stuff with people for an hour. But the main reason I bring it up is because, it's a pro-gun libertarian podcast. And so maybe if you like how they treat me, you'll listen to more of their shows. So I'll provide a link in the show notes for the 1% of you who actually check the show notes.
And thanks to Nate Spencer for our wonderful music.
I accommodate assholes, and he's an asshole with accommodation. Our tolerances are assorted, and so's our podcast. Good night, everybody.
Good night.